So thanks so much for joining us for tonight's program. Tonight we're really kicking off King's Chapel's programming for National Preservation Month. Each May is Preservation Month in the United States, and it's an opportunity to celebrate historic places throughout the US in the role of place in preserving and sharing our nation's history. This year, the Preservation Month theme from the National Trust for Historic Preservation is telling the full story, or hashtag tell the full story, which is all about providing the opportunity to focus on less dominant and historically marginalized stories and places in our nation's history, and to focus on sharing the fuller and more truthful histories that surround us. So our topic tonight, Madame Bulfinch's Boston, Boston's changing landscape through the eyes of one woman, aims to lift up women's voices in relation to Boston's history as an ever-changing landscape and a hub of architectural growth in the early 19th century. And to do so, we'll focus on a name that may be familiar to many of us, especially those in Boston. And it may be a name that may be familiar to us even if we weren't previously aware of it. And that name is Bulfinch. If it sounds familiar, but you can't place it, here are a few places where you may have seen it around the city of Boston. If you're from the Boston area, there's an area called Bulfinch Triangle. There's the Bulfinch entrance to the Massachusetts State House, and even the Bulfinch Pub, which is the original name of the Cheers Bar, which is located on Beacon Street in Boston. And all of these are named for a notable Boston architect, Charles Bulfinch, who in many ways helped transform Boston's landscape in the first half of the 19th century. You're probably familiar with some of his notable designs, again, whether you know it or not, because his notable designs include both the Massachusetts State House and the US Capitol building in Washington, DC. So Charles Bulfinch is pictured here on the right of the screen. And while he's definitely an important figure in tonight's conversation, our aim is to explore the reflections on the city from another member of his family. Charles's mother, Susan Apthorp Bulfinch, who is pictured on the right in this really elegant portrait by Joseph Blackburn, which is held at the MFA in Boston. So who is Susan Apthorp Bulfinch? On a super basic level, she was a lifelong King's Chapel congregant and a lifelong Bostonian, as well as, again, the mother of famed Federalist period architect Charles Bulfinch. Before diving further, though, I think it's important for us to get to know Susan Apthorp Bulfinch a little bit better. So Susan was born in Boston in 1734 to Grizel Eastwick and Charles Apthorp, who was a major colonial merchant. She had a very privileged upbringing with, as her daughter later reflected, quote, every advantage that leisure, affluence, and affection could afford to improve the strong and ardent mind. This upbringing and life of comfort, however, did come at a major cost, as her family's wealth was derived from her grandfather's Caribbean sugar plantations, and her father was a major importer of enslaved people in colonial Boston, and the family enslaved many people in their home. When she was in her 20s, she married a prominent physician, Dr. Thomas Bulfinch II, who's pictured here on the right side of your screen. And the couple had several children, including, as I mentioned before, architect Charles Bulfinch. In King's Chapel, so within her church, both Susan and her husband Thomas had prominent roles in the church community. Her husband was the church's lay leader during the period of King's Chapel's transformation from a historically Anglican church into the first Unitarian congregation in the United States. And he was responsible for both the initial hiring and the lay ordination of the church's first Unitarian minister, James Freeman. Susan herself had the responsibility during her later years of handling the collection plate money for the church, including being responsible for directing the investments of these funds and determining where amongst the church's charitable interests they'd be distributed. She also personally donated a large portion of the church's collection of communion silver, some of which is actually on display at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston as well. Over the course of her life, which she lived until she was 81 years old, Susan Apthorp Bulfinch bore witness to major periods of change and transformation in her home city, including the American Revolution, which ultimately scattered her family to different sides of the Atlantic. In letters addressed to her brothers in England, she shares a treasure trove of her reflections and observations on Boston's changing landscape in the early 19th century. And over a 20-year period in Boston between 1790 through 1810, which is around the time that she's writing these letters in the early 1800s, Boston's population had nearly doubled. So not only was the city physically growing, but it was growing in population as well. From the filling in of Mill Pond to the architectural works of her son, the details of her letters really help paint a vivid picture of a city in transition. And with that, we'll kind of transition into tonight's topic with this quote from one of her letters. In an undated letter addressed to one of her, quote, dear brothers, Susan wrote the following: the town of Boston is so grown you would scarce know it for your native place. Almost every spot of land is new covered with brick buildings and paved streets, and hackney coaches make it very noisy. To her knowledge, this is her first letter that she shares her reflections on changing city with her relatives abroad. And the area she describes in this initial excerpt is an area that her siblings who previously lived in Boston in their childhoods and youth would have known really well during that time, and that is of State Street. Susan writes, quotes, the old mansion house on State Street is converted into a bank, the outside handsomely ornamented. A large and elegant state house is built near the common. Both the building and situation are the admiration of strangers. The old townhouse, neatly fitted up and divided into shops and stores, where all of the variety of manufacturers from all parts of the world are exhibited and draw attention of the young and the gay. And the image I'm showing on your screen now, which is an oil painting of State Street in 1801 by artist James Brown Marston, which is held this painting is held in the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society. But it's really a perfect illustration of what Susan is describing here. I'll mention as well that in this particular section of the talk, I've definitely relied on the accompanying information to the painting from the Mass Historical Society. So I just wanted to share that as well. It's a really great resource. But as she's writing in the early 1800s, as I said, this painting here really helps depict what she's talking about. The quote unquote old mansion house she mentioned here was formerly a home of the wealthy Apthorp family in Boston, and again would have been well known to Susan and her siblings. As seen here, it's located next to Boston's Old State House. The information that accompanies this painting notes that the Apthorp Mansion is to the right of the Old State House, so I've circled that building. And this location of this family mansion physically placed members of the Apthorp family really at the epicenter of a number of revolutionary events in Boston, including the Boston Massacre in 1770, the reading of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the Proclamation of Peace in 1783 at the end of the war. As I mentioned earlier, many members of the Apthorp family, including Susan's brothers, left Boston during the war, as in some actually ended up living in England the rest of their lives, like her brothers, as I said, as they had loyalist allegiances during the revolution. And as she shares in that letter, and also seen in this image here, by this point, the former family mansion located near the Old State House had been turned into a bank. She also talks, of course, about the Old State House, or Old Town House, as she mentions it, being transformed into shops and businesses. So I've circled the Old State House in this painting here. And here on the left is a 19th century photograph that illustrates this adaptive use of the building as well. If you look here, you can see United States Telegraph Co. And all these other signs kind of showing these businesses in the Old State House. This is from a later period in the 19th century, but it really helps illustrate her points, as well as a photograph on the right of the Old State House as it's seen in downtown Boston today. While this building had previously been the seat of colonial government, in Massachusetts prior to the American Revolution. As we've said, it was now adapted for commercial use and would be used this way on and off for much of the 19th century, prior to when the Bostonian Society first installed a museum in the building in the 1880s. This historic site still stands in Boston today, as mentioned and seen here, and is an important historic site and museum today as part of the organization Revolutionary Spaces. And in this same letter, of course, Susan also has a really casual mention to one of her son's most recognizable buildings, and that's the current Massachusetts State House. While the State House has definitely grown since its original construction in the late 1790s, Susan's son, Charles Bulfinch, was responsible for the original building's design. The original portion of the building, which is seen in this historic photograph on the right, was completed in 1798 and features a series of classical inspired columns and a prominent golden dome, which is part of what makes this historic landmark so recognizable in Boston's landscape today. The dome, however, was not originally gold. It was coated in copper sheeting, which was produced by Paul Revere's company, before it was first gilded in gold leaf in the 1870s. And the building was further expanded in the 1890s and 1910s, but the central portion, designed by Bulfinch, remains today. And you can see a contemporary photograph of the Massachusetts State House next to the historic photograph in the top right-hand corner. In addition to the Massachusetts State House, he also designed a number of other important civic buildings, including the Old Connecticut State House, and the Maine State House, after Maine separated from Massachusetts to become its own state. And as I mentioned earlier, was also the architect of the US Capitol, which was a post that he held from 1818 to 1829, during which time he designed the Capitol Rotunda and original dome. So on your screen here, at the bottom, we have a recognizable image of the US Capitol building today, as well as a historic image in the top left, which shows the building as it looked following the work designed by Bulfinch and its original dome, which of course differs visually from the dome on the building today. And in addition to discussing changes and growth in Boston in the form of new buildings and new uses for older buildings, Susan's letters also explore the physical growth and expansion of the city. While many of her letters are undated, in a letter from July 1811, she writes to her brothers about the taking down of Beacon Hill and the filling of Mill Pond, which is one of the early examples of Boston's physical growth through filling in land. While the filling of Back Bay is typically like the most classic example of this, Mill Pond was an early step in literally expanding the city's footprint through creating more land from where there used to be marshes and water. Susan writes here that, quote, Old Beacon Hill, which is a neighborhood in Boston, I'm still named for it today, Old Beacon Hill is taking down to fill in the mill pond, as every foot of ground has become so valuable. The owners of the hill, who were the heirs of Governor Hancock, did not incline to lose the opportunity of making it useful and of preferred interest to elegance, not a very new thing. I believe I mentioned to you we are building a new courthouse, and it is a white stone and will be very handsome when completed, planned and superintended by my son. Of course, here we see another little family update about her son's work to his uncles abroad. But the main focus, of course, is about the taking down of Beacon Hill and filling of Mill Pond. For modern day Bostonians, Mill Pond is actually what's now called Bulfinch Triangle, due to Charles Bulfinch's involvement in designing the street layouts on the new lands. But generally, it's located around kind of between the North End, West End area in the Boston, where Route 93, the central artery, cuts through the city. So here in this image, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but kind of on the right of the Mill Pond is highlighted in blue. And on the right, we're looking at the North End. So We can see Salem Street here, North Street, or this is actually Hanover Street here. And then this is kind of like West End area here. There's really great information about the archaeology done at the site in recent decades. It's available through the city of Boston. Historically, Mill Pond was a marshy area that was dammed off from the rest of the bay and adapted to use water power for mills in the area, including grist mills. And you can see in this map here, the mill dam where Mill Pond was created. And here is another historic map of Boston, but this one here shows the street plan of early Bulfinch Triangle, and you can see that triangle shape pretty well. Following issues with the mills themselves and the water quality in the pond, discussions opened up in the late 1790s about filling in Mill Pond to create more land for the city. And an agreement was reached between the owners of the pond in the city in 1807 to begin work on the project. And over the span of about 20 years, land from two nearby hills in the city, Copp's Hill, which is in the north end. So if you're familiar with Boston, there's Copp's Hill Burying Ground, which is very close to the Old North Church on Salem Street. So that's kind of Copp's Hill area. And then Beacon Hill, which is near the current Massachusetts State House. This image here depicts kind of the taking down of Beacon Hill and shows the State House as pictured earlier in that process. But this project created about 50 new acres of land that were added to the city. I'm by no means an expert on this project, but I highly encourage those who are interested in learning more about Mill Pond, as well as the archaeology done there during the Central Artery Project or Big Dig, to check out the online exhibit from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, as well as this really interesting article from Boston University regarding artifacts from a brothel in the Mill Pond area that were uncovered during this archaeology. That really shares a lot more information and history about the area that used to be around Mill Pond before the land was recreated. Along with the landfill that eventually contributed to the massive amount of Boston's growth, annexing towns was another change that Susan wrote about, namely with Dorchester in the area that's now called South Boston. Before the newly created land, that is now part of Boston, Boston was sort of shaped like a frying pan with a skinny neck. And this original landmass was referred to as the Shawmut Peninsula. And this is really well illustrated in these maps here, which show kind of the original landmass when we talk about Boston, as well as the areas that have been created through landfill. So the picture on the left is labeled. The colors are a little close, so I hope it kind of shows clearly. But the original landmass is in the darker green, and this kind of like lightish blue color, where Back Bay, South Bay, this whole area here near Noddle's Island, this is actually East Boston where the airport is. All of this is created land, but the original landmass we're talking about, the Shawmut Peninsula, is here. So this is Boston. This is actually where Mill Pond was, where there's that kind of divot up top. And there's the skinny, skinny part that was referred to as the neck. If you weren't taking a boat across the Charles River or Back Bay, you travel down land by the neck to leave Boston for other parts of Massachusetts before this land was filled in. And this travel down the neck in the summers led to Susan's reflections about the growth along it following the annexation of Dorchester Neck into Boston proper, which took place in 1804. This is again another picture, the same one from the previous slide, but this is just kind of a cutesy picture I found showing the different neighborhoods in Boston today. but it points out kind of where Dorchester is and South Boston as well. So these are areas that were added later on, whereas the original Boston was much smaller in terms of the landmass. So she observed of these summer travels, quote, "As our dear little children have passed the summer in the country, I have had frequent opportunities of noticing the improvements making in different directions. So many houses have been built upon the neck in the middle, well paved. It has now more the appearance of town than country. The remaining lands are judiciously laid out for handsome streets and house lots, which are sold upon condition to purchasers billed within 3 years from the time of sale. Dorchester Points and Heights are annexed to the town by a late act of the legislature. A bridge uniting them is nearly completed. It is to be called South Boston and will afford many delightful situations in commanding the extensive prospect and will also be an accommodation to men or business." So again, these pictures here, so what she's talking about is South Boston. Originally, of course, looking at this picture on the left, was connected by a bridge because this lighter colored land that's Boston today wasn't actually in existence at the time until it was filled in later on. And then, so she's talking about the neck, and then Dorchester is down here. So all of this was added into the city at a later point. As explained by the National Park Service in Boston at Dorchester Heights, quote, its historical significance and the development of the surrounding community vividly reflect the history and growth of the city of Boston. With the fortification of its summit in 1776, Dorchester Heights contributed significantly to one of Boston's major victories and demonstrated the integral connection between them and the Boston Peninsula and her neighboring community. The annexation of Dorchester Neck to Boston in 1804 strengthened that length. And later on, as I mentioned, the filling in of South Bay would physically connect South Boston to the Shawmut Peninsula, helping create the lands that we know as Boston in 2021. And while the developments discussed already mark some of the larger changes in the city, Susan also reflected on a lot more. And I'll talk about a few of them, which are, for the most part, now lost parts of Boston that I find particularly interesting. One place that no longer physically exists, although the building that it was located in, Harvard Hall at Harvard College, seen on the page here, both then and now, does exist, was a room at Harvard College called the Philosophy Chamber. The Philosophy Chamber is no longer in existence, but it was during Susan Apthorp Bulfinch's time, though it was in some ways recreated through a special exhibit from the Harvard Art Museums back in 2017. She writes of these changes here. I'm sorry. Well, the developments discussed already mark some of the larger changes. There's these smaller changes as well. In a letter talking about news and growth in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her brothers, she writes, in the context of a new bridge being built, quote, "A very handsome bridge has been built, which brings the colleges within 4 miles of us." So this is a bridge connecting the Shawmut Peninsula across the Charles River with Cambridge. There are many new buildings in Cambridge that are erecting a new college. The students are so numerous as to make it necessary. There are more than 200 in number. In the library room are 14,000 volumes, well chosen and handsomely bound. A librarian constantly attends and shows them to strangers. The philosophical room and museum are well supplied. It may be hard to imagine a Harvard College of only about 200 years ago with only about 200 students. But again, we're talking about kind of the growth of Boston throughout history. We know from Susan's letters that she was a really avid reader, so it's no surprise that she was impressed with the library. And although she has a very brief mention of the philosophical room and museum at Harvard, it's a really interesting glimpse into the past. The philosophy chamber, as it's called, which is a room at Harvard Hall, was like an expanded cabinet of curiosities and used as teaching collections at Harvard. It was in existence on the campus from 1766 through 1820, though many of the items in the collection are still in the collections of Harvard's various museums and libraries. Like I said, although Harvard Hall still stands today, the room itself hasn't existed since 1820. It was an interdisciplinary connection ranging from kind of wilds and all sorts of scientific instruments. One of them is pictured here, this Joseph Pope Grand Ore, taxidermied animals, fine arts, rocks and minerals, cultural artifacts, and more. The 2017 exhibit collected objects displayed in the original space into the same gallery space for the first time in nearly 200 years. And these are just some photographs and images. There's an article from the Harvard Gazette discussing this exhibit and the history of the philosophy chamber, as well as an image of the exhibit space during this 2017 exhibit. And you can see that there's these, grand oil paintings being displayed with taxidermied animals, which looks like a bald eagle, perhaps. And then the owl here is kind of on the main page on the Harvard Art Museum's website describing the exhibit. Another interesting piece in Susan's letters is an extensive description of a prison, which she had personally visited. For anyone who may be familiar with her son, Charles Bulfinch, there's kind of an infamous story about his life in which he ironically spent time jailed in a prison of his own making for debt. And this prison she's discussing here is that place. This is excerpted from a much longer story about her visit to what later became known as the Charlestown State Prison. And she says, quote, "A state prison or penitentiary houses now erecting there of large hammered stone. It is divided into solitary cells lighted by small, I think I said apertures, in the walls, each cell just large enough to contain a bed, a small table and chair. I have been in one of them and supposed a few hours in the day a person might read in them. What a melancholy reflection that human nature should require such restriction. But it is a fact that one of the laborers employed upon the building was convicted of an attempt to forge a lottery ticket that had drawn the highest prize. Forgery with us is not a capital crime, therefore probable he will be the first person confined within its dreary walls, there leisuring and reflect upon his own folly." The prison, which, as I mentioned, was located in Charlestown, was decommissioned in 1955, but was in use for about 150 years. And this prison was a place where notable historical figures, including Sacco and Vanzetti, as well as Malcolm X, were incarcerated at times. The prison, which no longer exists today, but is pictured here on your screen, stood on the present day campus of Bunker Hill Community College, for those familiar with the area. That's kind of the general area where the Charlestown State Prison was located. Her reflections on changes in Boston's landscape also noted major events that impacted the city's buildings and landscapes, including a major storm in October of 1804. This, of course, is not an image from 1804, but it is sort of relevant to what she talks about in her letter. Susan describes the storm as follows, quote, "We have melancholy accounts of storms in different parts of the continent, and just now we have a tremendous one here. It commenced yesterday morning, and now at 12 o'clock it seems to be abating. Steeples of churches are blown off to a considerable distance, large trees torn up by the roots of which we have a specimen in our own garden. We have one at least 9 inches diameter and suppose 50 feet at length and lying prostrate, and one fine large weeping willow, not finding room enough to spread itself on the ground, has fallen against the house but done no other damage than breaking a few windows. The trunk of this tree measures at least 5 feet diameter. That seems like an exaggeration to me, but that's what she wrote. I have reached my 70th year and do not recollect any storm equal to the present. This storm, which was known as the Great Gale of 1804, was a major hurricane that took place in October of that year. And in addition to damaging Susan's home and garden, this storm tore the original steeple off of the Old North Church, the north end, as well as pulled off part of the roof of King's Chapel. And I use this image here because this is a picture from Hurricane Carol in 1954, the second time the Old North Church lost its steeple in a hurricane. So I thought it was kind of a fitting image here. But early preservation efforts would have helped repair the damage caused to these historic buildings during this historic storm. So Boston has changed exponentially since Susan Apthorp Bulfinch's time, but also through the help of historic preservation, in some ways at least visually remain the same. Even beyond King's Chapel, a church where Susan can actually still be visited as she's buried in our church crypt, there are many aspects of her Boston that still remain. In her letters for existence, along with King's Chapel, the old State House, and the new State House, she also mentions Park Street Church, the Granary Burying Grounds, what's now St. Stephen's in the North End, and of course the Boston Common. Both in the first decade of the 1800s when she was writing these letters, and now, as Susan wrote, quote, "The Common still remains free, and we hope always will as we really begin to be crowded," which in some ways is kind of stressing the importance of open spaces in cities, and perhaps signaling and understanding that would become central to future urban planning throughout the United States, and to the public parks movement that emerged later in the century. And with that, I think we'll conclude and move on to the question portion. I really enjoyed the process of researching this presentation. Reading through Susan's letters has really provided such kind of a rich kind of look into not only her mind, but her world. And I was really excited to be able to share this history to you all. So we'll move into questions in a moment, but I also want to let you know of our upcoming events, which is our next